So as we get into our discussion about Mr. Sinister, what we're going to find here is that, much like Apocalypse, Sinister is usually always a hidden hand. He's usually always in the background manipulating things. And as we'll learn with this video, he's actually manipulated a lot of different people's lives. Havok, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Madelyne Prior, and Wolverine. He's manipulated their existence in such a way that it always usually comes out to his benefit or to some kind of plan that he's orchestrated. And this is the fundamental principle of Mr. Sinister. Rather than being someone like Magneto, who's always on the front lines and engaging in the really gritty work, Sinister just hides. He usually just stays back, but he always appears at some of the more interesting times. Now, what we're going to see with this video is that we're going to start off with the initial appearance of Mr. Sinister in Marvel Comics, and then as we progress, we're going to more or less fly through a few things, because again, Sinister just kind of pops up, provides some information, and then goes away. But once we actually get to the further adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, we'll learn the basis behind Sinister's existence, why it was that he's created, as well as his obsession with both Cyclops and Jean Grey. And then we'll segue back into, and I guess do this big circle where we revolve, or I guess move ourselves back to when it was that he had first appeared and why. Now, Sinister first appeared in Uncanny X-Men issue number 221. And again, this is almost immediately after the events of the Mutant Massacre. Now, because we've talked about the Mutant Massacre in a few videos before, we're not really going to go that in-depth into it, but what we had seen is that with the end of the Mutant Massacre, Psylocke had scanned the mind of Sabretooth, and when she did, she had seen some hidden benefactor, someone shrouded in darkness that she couldn't quite make out. And this was more or less Chris Claremont telling us that there's some hidden hand, very similar to the way Apocalypse had first appeared under Louise Simonson. Now, with issue number 221, we learned that Sinister is actually the guy that orchestrated the entire Mutant Massacre event. He's the one that set the event in motion. Now, his motivations for doing this, again, was because of the fact that he had looked at the Morlocks and believed that there was perhaps some involvement of himself within the creation of the Morlocks. Of course, we know that this was the result of Dark Beast manipulating mutants in this time and creating the Morlocks due to the fact that the Dark Beast had more or less been a student of Mr. Sinister in the Age of Apocalypse storyline. But with the Mutant Massacre event and with this story, what we had seen was that Sinister has instructed the Marauders, his henchmen, to attempt to kill Madelyne Prior a second time. Now, this is when we begin to see things intertwining, and we begin to see all these different stories and different groups meeting one another at these crossroads. If you recall our discussion about the formation of X-Factor, we had talked about how there came a point whereby when X-Factor was formed, that Cyclops had abandoned both Madelyne Prior and his infant son. There came a point when Cyclops went back to try to find Madelyne Prior and his son again, but of course they were gone. Now, it was shown to us that Madelyne Prior seemed to have been killed and that his infant son had simply just vanished. We didn't know where he went. And what we learned with this story is that it was actually the Marauders that had attempted and presumably been successful in killing Madelyne Prior and had kidnapped the infant son of Cyclops and taken him to Mr. Sinister. Now, what is revealed to us in this story as well is that Madelyne Prior had actually survived, that Madelyne Prior had ended up in a hospital, but that again, Cyclops wasn't really aware of this. Cyclops didn't really know. Now, from here, we transition to the fall of mutants, and with the fall of mutants storyline, of course, again, the event that led up to the formation of Excalibur, we had seen that Madelyne Prior had presumably actually been killed alongside the other X-Men. But of course, again, as we had seen, the X-Men hadn't been killed. They had simply just been removed from all forms of observation, with the exception of the naked eye. And so unless anyone who recognized the X-Men had seen them, they would have been presumed dead by virtually anyone. And so this was when Sinister had more or less assumed that Madelyne Prior, that the situation had been taken care of. Now, again, at this point, we don't know why it was that he had gone after Madelyne Prior in the first place, but what we see is that Madelyne Prior launches something called the Inferno event, and Madelyne Prior returns as the Goblin Queen. She, of course, had struck a bargain with some demons in limbo and so on, and of course that goes into the Inferno event proper, but the idea here is that she's returned to looking for for her infant son. And of course, she knows that that Mr. Sinister has her child. Now, what this does is this segues into Uncanny X-Men issue number 241 as part of the Inferno event. And as part of this Inferno event, Sinister reveals to Madelyne Prior that, again, he had been manipulating her entire existence. And this is actually a really interesting story, because what it does, it gives us a lot of insight into the existence of Madelyne Prior, as well as the involvement of Sinister within the lives of both Cyclops and Jean Grey. What Sinister tells us is that Madelyne Prior had been a clone of Jean Grey, that when Jean Grey had taken on the Phoenix Force and then become the Dark Phoenix, which resulted in her presumed death on the moon, that Sinister had a problem. And the problem was, without Jean Grey, there's no way for him to create this more or less uber mutant that could serve whatever purpose it was that he was looking for it to serve. And so what he did is he took some genetic material of Jean Grey and he had cloned her and made Madelyne Prior out of that clone. But when Madelyne Prior had been created, when she had reached her maturity, she hadn't developed any mutant powers. And so it would have been impossible for him to actually pass her off as Jean Grey. But the other half of this equation is that when Jean Grey had died, or presumably been killed, that the Phoenix Force had sparked life inside of Madelyne Prior. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that Madelyne Prior had developed any abilities. It just simply means the Phoenix Force had provided her with just enough to actually give her character some life. And so this is when Sinister came up with the idea of initiating contact between Madelyne Prior and Cyclops, knowing that as soon as Cyclops had seen Madelyne Prior, he would immediately fall in love with her because he would be reminded of Jean Grey. And over the course of this situation, Sinister played things out and manipulated the two of them in such a way that they would produce a child, which led to Sinister going after Madelyne Prior and the child. Now, the reason why Sinister had pursued and attempted to kill Madelyne Prior was, as he explains, Madelyne Prior, of course being the clone of Jean Grey, could not exist while Jean Grey was alive, when it was revealed that Jean Grey was alive. And the reason is because Jean Grey is a telepath, and with Jean Grey being a telepath, she would have immediately scanned the mind of Madelyne Prior once she saw her as a direct clone of herself and learned about the existence of Sinister. And so Sinister sent the Marauders after Madelyne Prior to attempt to remove her from the equation, but Sinister had believed this problem had been taken care of when Madelyne Prior had supposedly been killed alongside the other X-Men. Now from here, we pick up with X-Factor issue number 39. And with X-Factor issue number 39, Madelyne Prior has more or less been removed from the equation, but what Sinister does is give us some insight into his involvement, his fascination with both Cyclops and Havok, in that he has apparently been manipulating their entire lives since they were both children in an orphanage in Nebraska. He had been experimenting on them, conducting various tests on them, and so on and so forth, and had more or less been shaping their lives, playing their lives out and monitoring them as they've progressed into adulthood. Now at this point, we transition to Cable issue number 6. And of course, Cable issue number 6 is after the events of the Executioner Song crossover event, whereby Strife, the future clone of Cable, had traveled into the past in an attempt to take revenge on both Jean Grey and Scott Summers, as well as try to kill Professor Charles Xavier. Now, at this point in time, Cable believed that he was the clone of Strife, that he was the copy. But what Sinister reveals to Cable in issue number 6 is that Cable is actually the original, and that Strife is the clone. Now, during this process, Sinister also awakens the element or the remains of Strife's mind within Cable's own mind, and in turn, Strife takes over the mind of Cable. And when he does, he of course again goes on a warpath against the X-Men. Now at this point, we transition to Cable Annual issue, 1999. And with Cable Annual 1999, Sinister expands a little more on what it was that he had told Cable in issue number 6. In issue number 6, all he had told Cable was that he was the real son of Madelyne Prior and Cyclops, and this Strife was the clone. In Cable Annual 1999, Sinister tells Cable that the whole reason for him to have been created, the whole reason why he was made, is because Sinister wanted someone that had hitherto unchallenged abilities, someone that could stand toe-to-toe and most likely overpower Apocalypse and destroy Apocalypse entirely. And so for Cable, this is an incredible revelation. This is an unbelievable revelation. But of course, Cable Cable, despite the fact that Sinister extends his hand and asks Cable to step into the role that had previously been created for him, Cable of course turns it down, refuses to side with Sinister, and goes about trying to reform his group. Now at this point, we transition to the I guess the origin stories, to the history of Sinister, with the stories of further adventures of Cyclops and Jean. Now with this story, there was a lot going on. There was quite a bit taking place. There was the involvement of Apocalypse, of Mr. Sinister, of Jean Grey, and Scott Summers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to rush through this a little bit, but we're going to try to make it make sense, just because it's a 4-part series, and we can make an entire video in and of itself focusing strictly on the background of Nathaniel Essex, or Mr. Sinister. What we learn in this story is that Nathaniel Essex, or Mr. Sinister's son, had previously passed away before the story had started. And as a result, Sinister had become obsessed with the idea of not only human evolution, but the possibility of bringing his son back to life. Now, it's not explicitly stated to us that his desire is to bring his son back, but all that's really given to us is this obsession with genetics, this obsession with human evolution. And in fact, Nathaniel Essex is the first one to apparently come across the idea that human beings will at some point evolve to a place where they will, I guess, overtake normal humanity in terms of their prowess, meaning that mutants will someday arrive on the planet Earth. And so for him, the idea is, how would this happen? How is this going to take place? What he does is he goes to the Royal Society, which is the society of the, I guess, the top minds in Britain at the time of scientists. And of course, he presents his idea to them, saying that Charles Darwin was on the first steps. He was taking baby steps into what would become a much bigger thing. But the mistake that he makes is he reveals to them what he perceives to be an example of a mutant later on, when he has more or less a Frankenstein figure, an individual that's been pieced together with different body parts. Now, of course, this being doesn't have life. It's simply just what he perceives to be a caricature of the most likely result of mutant manipulation or mutant existence. Of course, the Royal Society at the time was not ready to see this, and they shun Nathaniel Essex and throw him out. And so as a result, Nathaniel Essex, who's somewhat down on his luck at this particular point in time, who has not really become estranged to his wife, but certainly began to move away from her, of course goes to a pub to drown his sorrows in alcohol. Along the way, he comes across a group who refer to themselves as Marauders. And what this group has done is it has gone about and captured what would be considered, I guess, by any real standard, the early version of the Morlocks. That is to say, individuals who are either physically deformed or somehow mentally touched. And the Marauders argue that this is a service they're doing to London, that the London police and London society don't have to worry about this because they're basically keeping these people shunted away. Their initial intention is to capture Sinister, to capture Nathaniel Essex, due to the fact that he's anemic, he's very pale, and for them this is a little strange. But what Nathaniel Essex does is he offers them an opportunity. He tells them that if they decide to work for him, basically, to bring him individuals whom they've captured, then of course he'll pay him very well for their work. And so the Marauders, this early version of the Marauders, come under the employ of Sinister and go about capturing various other individuals. In addition, we see the Marauders taking the people that they have currently captured back to the residence of Nathaniel Essex, down into a basement laboratory that he's created. And in this basement laboratory, he begins experimenting on these mutants. Now, we don't know off the top of our heads, or at least it's not given to us, whether or not he's actually, I guess, physically taking them apart, physically examining them. That's more or less hinted to us in the fact that Nathaniel Essex says that he's made great leaps in his understanding of the human genome. So that more or less tells us that he is physically breaking down their bodies, that he's killing them and then performing autopsies and examining them. And this is how Sinister functions for quite some time. But during this story, Apocalypse has also awoken. He's come back out of his suspended animation. And when he does, he goes about the process of examining the planet Earth, which is normal for Apocalypse. Whenever Apocalypse wakes up from a slumber, he examines the planet to see whether or not it's the proper time for him to invoke his ideas of survival of the fittest and attempt to take over the world. And when he gets to London, he of course meets Nathaniel Essex after having killed a couple of the Marauders and interrogated the last remaining member. And what this last remaining member of the Marauders says is that Nathaniel Essex is performing experiments. He's trying to understand the concept of evolution in terms of humans eventually becoming mutants. And so what Apocalypse does is he undertakes a guise and meets Nathaniel Essex. He shapeshifts and changes his form. And when he meets Nathaniel Essex, what Apocalypse realizes is that as far as he understands, he's the first step. He's the very first mutant, which is Marvel coming out and telling us that this is the case. This is Marvel telling us that Apocalypse is the first mutant to have ever existed. And so what Apocalypse says is that because he is the first mutant, that by his very existence, he should be the leader of all mutants forthwith. And so what he tells Sinister is to continue his plans, to continue his schemes. Of course, Sinister, amazed by the power that Apocalypse has, but also using the ulterior motive that because he's been kicked out of the Royal Society and shunned by virtually the entire intellect of Britain as a whole, that he's going to need more powerful friends. And so with Apocalypse at his side, he begins experimenting again. He begins conducting his experiments and going about trying to understand the genome and the evolution of humanity. Now, at this same time, there's also a couple other things taking place. Of course, the wife of Nathaniel Essex is, again, become more and more estranged to him. She is, as she explains, still in love with him, but she's beginning to fear for what it is that he's becoming. Now, at the same time, we also see that Jean Grey and Scott Summers are sent into the past. And the reason they're sent into the past is because it is common knowledge in the present timeline that Sinister had become who he is as a result of genetic manipulation at the hands of Apocalypse. And so what's basically going on with Jean Grey and Scott Summers is that while they arrive in two different locations in London, they're one, racing to meet one another, and two, racing to stop Nathaniel Essex from becoming a henchman of Apocalypse. But of course, as we know, this ultimately fails. Now, over the course of this story, as the comic progresses, we of course see that Nathaniel Essex begins to give in to the more darker side of his nature, that his initial rationale of saying that science is above any kind of decency or morality stops being simple, talk and becomes something that he actually believes, to the point that when his wife leaves him after discovering that he had dug up the body of their son and was experimenting on him, that she eventually succumbs to an illness. And when she does, she is dying. And so Nathaniel Essex goes to visit her. But when he goes to visit her, she says that she doesn't know who he is anymore, that she doesn't love him anymore, and that he's truly become something sinister, which of course results in Nathaniel Essex taking the name Sinister once he is genetically manipulated by Apocalypse. And this is what we see with his character as time progresses. Over the course of this comic, or over the course of the series, we eventually learned that with Nathaniel Essex, his concern is that there's just not enough time for him to really understand the human genome. There's not enough time for him to perform all his work. And so after creating a covenant or a pact with Apocalypse, Apocalypse manipulates the genes of Sinister and effectively makes him immortal, which of course results in Sinister being displayed to us with the pale skin and his normal physical features. Now from here, we transition to Weapon X Volume 1, Issue number 14. And what this does is it gives us this in-between period between the time that Sinister had been experimenting on mutants in the early stages of mutants in the 19th century, all the way up until the current day. Now, it leaves out a few places. In fact, it actually just picks up during World War II. But what we learned with Sinister is that during this time when he was manipulating the genes of individuals, that he was laying the foundation for what would eventually become Weapon X. Now, this doesn't mean that Sinister had formed Weapon X. What it means is that Sinister, going through his entire existence, manipulating the genes of other individuals, experimenting on various individuals, and so on and so forth, had his paperwork discovered when he had abandoned the project. And the reason why is because Sinister had been operating under the guise of being a Nazi during World War II. And this allowed Sinister the ability to, experiment on human beings without any real regard or anyone questioning his motivations, because at the time in Nazi Germany, it was common practice for experiments to be performed on anyone who was not a Nazi or not a previously established, example of what a German should be. But when the Nazi camps were liberated, when they were freed by the Allied forces, Sinister had abandoned all of his work, and the work was discovered by the initial founders, those individuals who would eventually form the Weapon X project. And using the work that Sinister had previously done, they would go on to experiment on people like Maverick, like Silver Fox and Sabretooth and Wolverine. and eventually lead us to the circumstance whereby we have the Weapon X project that created the character of Wolverine. Now from here, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to a close, and the reason why is because while Sinister exists so on and he moves on forward, and of course there's Miss Sinister and things like that, Sinister is not really relevant here. Sinister appears from time to time, but the importance of his character had really been established in the 1980s and 1990s, and then began to drop off to the point where he was relegated to a background character, and he was never quite as formidable of a villain as he had previously been. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.